This time it's 5 more classic British 350s from the 1950s. In the early years of motorcycling, the 350 class was extremely important. These are the most common machines on the road for many years. They were the bikes that people rode to work on, the bikes that people went out for weekend rides on, and sometimes the machines that people raced on too. Yes, the 350 was seen as a good, sturdy, dependable bike with just the right amount of power given the roads of the time. And so here are 5 more classic British 350s from the 1950s. The AGS Model 16, a matchless G3. The AGS Model 16 and its matchless equivalent were some of the longest running traditional British singles. They were a development of the matchless G3L of World War II service. AMC were early adopters of hydraulically damped front forks, and these can be seen on immediate post-war machines for both matchless and AGS. In fact, they've been used during the war too. The rear ends of these bikes though were rigid. The machines were essentially identical, except the badges of course, but to help differentiate on early models, the magneto was carried at the front on the AGS and at the rear of the cylinders on the matchless, although they would later match up. In 1953, the Model 16 was modernised somewhat. It gained a dual seat and some styling changes. In 1956, that clunky Berman gearbox was replaced by one of AMC's own design. This successful 4-speed unit would carry on for many years and even be used in later Norton models such as the Commando. And in 1957 there was a major overhaul which saw the replacement of the generator with an all-new crankshaft mounted Lucas alternator, and that leaky pressed steel covering over the primary drive was replaced by an aluminium casting, which was far better. In the chassis department, unlike much of their competition, the AGS was never fitted with plunger rear suspension and would remain rigid until 1949 when proper swinging arm suspension was added as an option. The engine used was an air-cooled 348cc 4-stroke single cylinder unit which made a claimed 16 horsepower at 5,600 rpm. This was fed to the ground for that 4-speed gearbox and gave a top speed claimed of around 78 miles an hour. With its old-fashioned brazed lug frame, the machine weighed in around 382 pounds or 173 kilos, so not the lightest bike here, but it was good and solidly built. And in fact the AMC bikes are some of the very best singles out there. The problem was they were in production for too long, and the fact that AMC spent such a large amount of money on what was basically an obsolete design contributed to their downfall. The Norton Model 50. The Norton Model 50 was designed by Edgar Franz in 1933 and was closely based on the Model 18 500. The model would remain in production until the outbreak of World War II in 1939. But interestingly, it would not return to the range again until 1956. Early models used a Lucas Mag dyno, but this was replaced in 1959 with an RM15 crank-mounted alternator. At the same time, the machine gained the famed featherbed frame. The machine used a 348cc overhead valve 4-stroke single-cylinder engine with an aluminium head and cast-iron barrel. It produced a claimed 18 horsepower at 6,000 rpm, which once put through the 4-speed gearbox was enough to push the bike along at around 75 miles an hour. In line with the rest of the range, in 1961 the bike would gain the new slimline frame, which at least would aid comfort, the tank not being quite so wide. But overall the handling was excellent, and the brakes, of course, being large drums front and back, was also extremely good. But there was no escaping the fact that this was a pre-war engine stuffed into a modern frame. The engine performance simply wasn't really up to the job, and in 1963 the machine was deleted from the range. Unfortunately these days there aren't a great number of these machines left on the road. Simply put, that underpowered engine and the excellent frame meant that people ripped the thing out and replaced it with, say, a Triumph motor. After all, what's the point of having a featherbed frame if the engine you've got will only allow you to cruise at 50 to 60 miles an hour? And this has unfortunately meant that survivors of this delightful little 350 are now few and far between. The Panther Model 75. Panther is a name synonymous with those very large capacity single cylinder engines with the sloping cylinder that acted as a stress member for the frame. However, the smaller machines in the range, the Model 65 250 and the Model 75 350, were built in quite a different way. The engine looks very similar, but does not use the cylinder as a stress member in the same way at all. They have a much more conventional looking upright cylinder, but in many ways the engine was similarly archaic to those big singles, using the oil kept in a casting at the front of the cylinder, for example. Production of the post-war Model 75 began in 1948, but with the first models going on sale in early 1949. These used telescopic forks of P&M's own design, but had a rigid rear end. And whilst the machine would see any minor changes in 51 and 52, new colour schemes and improved braking for example, 1953 would see a major improvement with the introduction of a new swinging arm frame. And in 54, Doughty forks replaced the P&M design ones, and the rigid rear end bikes were taken off the list completely. 57 would see a dual seat adopted as standard, before in 1962 a machine which was already out of date when introduced was finally phased out of production. The model was of course an overhead valve single with a separate gearbox and engine. It ran a bore and stroke of 71 by 88 and had a low compression ratio of 6.5 led to 6.7 to 1. Top end power was of course fairly modest, only around the 15 horsepower bracket, so top speed is going to be around 75 miles an hour, probably on a good day. But the engine compensates for this poor performance by having bags of pre-war charm and developing lots of torque, so at least you won't need to use the gearbox too much. Never a big seller, the 75 is quite rare now, but they do come up for sale occasionally and they're much cheaper to buy than the big slopers, so a bargain buy if you happen to be a Panther fanatic. The Douglas Dragonfly. Unlike so many British motorcycle manufacturers, Douglas were not based in the centre of England, but were actually based in Kingswood near Bristol, being founded there by two brothers William and Edwin Douglas in 1882. Both had initially started as blacksmiths before moving into foundry work, where they would cast such items as manhole covers. In 1902, one of the brothers' customers, a Joseph Barter, began the development of an engine to fit into a bicycle frame. He would develop the Fee bicycle engine system, the Fee using a 200cc flat twin engine. The brothers made castings for the company, but when they went bankrupt in 1907, the brothers swept in and took over the production rights, building their own 350cc version of the flat twin and developing it into a proper motorcycle. Now, unlike later flat twins, the early Douglases ran the engine fore and aft, with later models placing the gearbox above the engine. And it was not in fact until 1934 and the 500cc Endeavour that Douglas would actually rotate the engine in the frame and give us a more familiar BMW/ABC-like flat twin layout. Interestingly, the side valve Endeavour also made use of shaft drive, although this would not be replicated in later models. Post-World War II, and Douglas unveiled their all-new 350 range. These now use the engine in a more conventional flat twin configuration, although the shaft drive of the Endeavour was dumped in favour of more conventional chain drive. Another unusual feature was the use of torsion bar suspension front and rear, but unfortunately things did not go well, and in 1948 an official receiver was appointed. The struggling company would next introduce the Dragonfly. This had slightly weird banana styling, and the engine was pretty much shared with the previous model, although the chassis was much more conventional. There was now a swinging arm frame with normal springs at the back. Wheels forks were adopted at the front, and these would add some extra weight, overall weight now being 365 pounds or 165.8 kilos. And despite its complexity, the 348cc overhead valve flat twin only made 17 horsepower at 5,500 rpm, so really only about the same as the average single cylinder machine of the same period. As a result, top speed was around 70 miles an hour. And unfortunately, while the machine was claimed to be one of the smoothest and most comfortable in its class, sales were very poor, and only just over 1,400 machines were sold before the company went to the war in 1957. The Excelsior Talisman 328. Owners of the Excelsior brand, Bayliss & Thomas, are one of the oldest manufacturers of motorcycles in Britain. They began producing bicycles in 1874, and in 1896 they were said to be the first company to import a motorcycle into Great Britain, this being a 1¼ horsepower Minerva. But the small company is probably best known for its World War II collapsible power scooter, a form of which would later be sold in the United States as the Indian Papoose, and in the United Kingdom as the Brockhouse Corgi. In 1949, the company unveiled their all-new, parallel twin 250cc two-stroke Excelsior Talisman model. The first touring model was fairly lightly tuned and was fitted with a single carburettor, and produced probably slightly less than 12 horsepower, for a top speed of only around 62 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour. So while the machine looked smooth and sophisticated, its performance, even by the standards of the day, was fairly underwhelming. So the bores were taken out from 50 to 58mm to create a 328cc engine. And this, and the addition of a second carburettor, would see power raised to 18 horsepower at 5,000 RPM, giving a much more respectable top speed in the 70 plus mile an hour bracket. But unfortunately, Excelsior were a small company and they simply didn't have the funds to further develop the engine. Although interestingly, they were able to develop a 3-cylinder version for use in a Berkeley microcar. But unfortunately in 1964, the Berkeley Car Company went into receivership, owing Excelsior a considerable amount of money for engines that had been supplied. And this left Excelsior with a big hole in their finances which they simply couldn't plug. And Excelsior were left with little choice but to follow Berkeley into bankruptcy. What collections of bikes would you like to see us do a video on? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.